Hello and welcome to Note to File, a clinical research podcast.
A collection of interviews, candid commentary, and general nonsense for the clinical research community.
Check us out at notetofilepodcast.com.
And now, without further ado, on to the show.
Hey guys, welcome to another Note to File Live. I'm your host, Brad Eagleheart Hightower.
And I'm Denali, and I got nothing.
We got to find a nickname for you.
You do your best. You let me know. You do some brainstorming. Get back to me.
All right, we'll talk about it. And lucky and glad to have our guest here today, young upstart in the healthcare writing field, Matthew Holt. Matthew, how's it going? Oh, I didn't unmute you. There we go. Sorry about that.
Try it again. Young is not something that's often said about me these days, so I like that. That's my nickname, Matthew Young Holt.
Perfect. See, good. He caught on quickly, so I need you to step it up a little bit.
I'll try better.
Right,
how much of this should we spend working on Denali's nickname? The whole show?
At least a good 20 minutes
until it's done. That's for sure.
I'll think of something. We'll keep
okay.
Well, Matthew, thank you again for coming on. I've been reading, your content for a while, and also I was trying to kind of branch out and talk to people not immediately connected to the clinical research field. So forgive us if we use bizarre, cryptic acronyms at times, as we're so used to doing. But just from the jump, tell us a bit about yourself and kind of why, maybe what encouraged you to decide to be a masochist and write about healthcare.
There's no good reason for that. It was just a force of accident. I sat in the wrong place in a class and ended up literally. It's a long, boring story, but I did back 35 years ago. Actually, about now 35 years ago, I was a grad student at Stanford, and by a series of complications, I ended up going from Japanese political science to U.S. healthcar. How I made that transition is
a jump.
Yeah, but it's a jump. The good news is more recently I've been getting back into Japan. The last few years I've been going there quite a bit to talk about health tech in Japan, and I'm heading back there next month, which is great because Japan's fantastic to go to. But yeah, the vast majority of my young career has been looking at the evolution of the healthcare system in the US and looking at digital tools in the healthcare system. So it hits research and pharma and devices and drugs, a lot, because you cannot avoid that. They are probably, as Vic Fuchs, the professor I took my first Stanford health econ class from, and by the way, the greatest health econ professor of all time, happy with the guy whose room I stumbled into. He was like lecturing his class at one point, and some of the doctors in it. And he said, if you took away all drugs, healthcare would be nowhere. And so, we need drugs, we need devices, we need stuff that makes people better. And then, actually, there was an argument in the class, I remember, as to whether anesthesia counted as a drug, because if you couldn't do surgery, back in the Civil War, right, they would do anesthesia without surgery. You chop people's arms off quickly, and the assistant's fingers would go with it after time.
Right.
But so I ended up really focusing in the 90s on the kind of .com boom, the use of the internet in healthcare, and the slow evolution of electronic medical records. And how that was changing or not changing the healthcare system. Yeah. And then in the 2000s, I ended up starting a conference called, I started my blog, the healthcare blog, but also that was an accident. That was a complete accident, but no one knew what a blog was back then. I'd done it. After the .com boom, I spent about a year on the beach in Asia running away because there were no jobs in San Francisco.
So why did you come back?
That is a very good question. I've not got the answer to yet. I think I met enough seedy 60-year-old, white guys in Thailand who I thought, I really don't know my life to be that guy. But there were moments. There you go. I remember coming back. I've been in Thailand or wherever, for Vietnam, and I came back and I went to a Thai restaurant here, and it wasn't as good as the Thai food in Thailand, and it was $25 a head instead of $2. I was thinking, why did I come back? while I was there, I did have a little travel blog. Blogger was just getting going, and I had photos and what have you, and I had one of those first digital cameras, and my dad and 7 other people were paying attention to what I was doing. So I put all these photos on Blogger, and when I got back, I thought, well, someone should be doing this for healthcare, and blogs were just taking it. Daily Kos and Insta Pundit, back in it's 2003. I thought somebody must have, a blog in healthcare, and so I actually went to reserve the URL healthcare blog, and somebody owns it. Somebody still owns it and has never used it. So I thought, well, that's not going to work. So so I reserved the healthcare blog.
Just one off them.
It's still there, right? But that evolved into by a series of more accidents and encouragement into a conference called Health 2.0. And really, I and Indu Subaya, my co-founder, spent, essentially 2006 to 2020 tracking, presenting, cheerleading, scoffing at, the evolution of digital tools in healthcare all across the board. And we did do a little bit about, research and a lot about data. But most of healthcare, in my view, is about sort of delivery of healthcare. That's the stuff that now you couldn't do healthcare. You couldn't have medicine without drugs, and you couldn't have drugs without clinical research. But the application of that clinical research into the healthcare delivery system is the lines and the trails are very fuzzy. It's not a clear line between one and the other. Yeah. And I'm sure if for experts like you in clinical research, when you dig into it, the what's going on in clinical research is a bit of a mess too, I'm sure. But certainly by the time it gets into the healthcare system and you start looking at practice variation and variation in costs and actual people, do people take their drugs as prescribed and that kind of stuff?
Yeah,
things are very fuzzy and messy. So, but I, if I have a claim to fame, it's from being kind of in the maelstrom of the evolution of the sort of digital health movement. And if I had and I say on my LinkedIn title, I'm a healthcare curmudgeon. The last few years, I've got increasingly grumpy about how much the wider healthcare system has resisted using, both the tools and the techniques and the new organizations it should be creating to improve healthcare using technology. And so that's the kind of thing I tend to rail about. Well, you'll probably get some of that in this.
So this is my biggest question was, at what point during your career journey did you begin to identify as the curmudgeon? Because I feel like there's a point in time where it's like, when is that acceptable to be like, you know what, screw it, this is it.
Old guy shaking hand, fist at cloud. That one,
right. When can I wear flannel and yell at children? When is this appropriate?
I think I've gone in and out. I think I've gone in waves. Okay. So I recall, my earliest work, the Stanford stuff, and afterwards was looking at what was then called managed care, which would now be called value-based care. Kind of, it doesn't really exist, but
very familiar with the concept. Yeah,
right, exactly. Everyone's familiar with the concept. No one can actually see it. It's like, well, we've never seen it in reality, but we're gonna follow.
It's like communism. There's a theory, right? In theory, it makes sense and it flows down.
By the way, I spent my time in England at Cambridge reading the Communist Manifesto. I have a degree in social and political science from Cambridge. I can tell you a lot about Karl Marx. And he was actually, I've given many talks comparing Karl Marx's theory of history to the American healthcare system. And I forgot the English healthcare system.
Yeah.
There's a group, we rely a lot on the Mongolian theory of Marxism here.
Okay.
So Lenin, Marx, and then taken on by Lenin, said society evolves, right? You start off with hunter-gatherers, then you get a feudal, which has serfs and lords. Then you go to feudal, eventually the technology revolution, which in that case was enclosures and agricultures, and eventually the industrial revolution takes you to the bourgeois and the proletariat, right? And then eventually, after the technology evolves even more, you move to communism, which is everyone's equal. And a bunch of guys from Mongolia went to meet Lenin in the early 1920s in Russia, and they were very impressed by this. And they went back to Mongolia and had a revolution, and they declared themselves, communist. Now, there's a lot of argument. Not that anyone gives a shit in Marxist theory about whether Russia had actually really left the feudal stage, let alone got to the bourgeois proletariat stage before it declared itself communist. But they went back to Mongolia, and they were hunter-gatherers, and they immediately declared themselves, we're gonna skip all these other stages and go to communism, right? Which is, they're still hunter-gatherers as far as I can see mostly. So yeah. And there's a lot of Americans saying, we're doing this, and all of a sudden we're going to be value-based care, and wondering why didn't we get from A to B?
Weird, huh?
We skipped C, D, E, and F, and you got to A to G or whatever. But yeah, how do we get there? Communism, the theory of, yes. I have no idea. How do we get to the theory of communism? Denali, you brought this up.
Well, I was thinking about the theory of value-based care. So you have something in theory that should work, on paper and black and white, and then you put it into practice, and you're like, well, no.
Well, it is like that. So it does, there are really good examples of what it is and what is it in practice. Look at Kaiser Permanente, look at the British. You have look at the New Zealand healthcare system. Look at the Swedes. You have a bunch of people who have primary care. Some other people in primary care. Everyone has a primary care relationship, and the primary care relationship makes it very hard to get to the expensive stuff, which is specialty care and expensive drugs. You have to go through a bunch of processes to get there, and by limiting access to the expensive stuff, you make it cheaper. You probably make healthcare better if you can do what And I'm a pretty strong proponent of what Kaiser's done in terms of expanding access to a lot of programs for people with heart problems and this, that, and the other.
Right.
And you could argue that on a population health level, they do it better than the overall population. You could also argue that, yes, I didn't get to my ABC specialist that I could have got to, who could have fixed me earlier. A lot of arguments about that in the medical literature, of course. But you do it pretty well. The problem has been is that, in the American system, we just declare value-based care or declare primary care, population health-led stuff in a place where there's no tradition of it, number one, which is usually outside the West Coast where Kaiser is. And number two, where there's no real financial incentives to it. We do these ACOs, which have no downside risk and whatever, and wonder why they don't really change and don't operate.
Right.
And the last part I'd say is within most of the economy, we have basically the rule that if you show up with a better, cheaper alternative to the thing that went before, people will flock to you, and the thing that went before will go away. Think Amazon versus Sears, just for an example. And in healthcare, you've got a bunch of incentive problems where there isn't this sort of cash pay where people, are incented to do, quote unquote, the right thing or provide something cheaper and better. Doesn't usually make them more money. In fact, sometimes makes them less money. And then you have a whole bunch of other sort of big barriers. You have this professional, what doctors have always done, what we taught in medical school, which is professional, the sort of professional barrier. And then you have the institutions, these huge institutions in healthcare, which are very powerful. We call them hospital systems and AMCs, and they do what they've always done, and they control a lot of the politics and the financial incentives. From Medicare on down, and so and there's a ton of lobbying from those groups. We always know that the American Hospital Association, the American Medical Association are some of the biggest spenders on lobbying. And
right.
So moving stuff along is just really you have these incentive barriers, institutional barriers, professional barriers, which don't really exist in the kind of rest of the free market economy. Of course, most actors in the rest of the free market economy are trying desperately hard to put in those barriers so that people can't get them out of the way. You can see that going on with AI right at the moment. Let's have some regulation to shut in place the people who are the leaders.
This is super in parallel to what you're seeing in clinical research, though, right? You have these major AMCs and health systems who historically have been, that is where clinical trial research was being done. And then you're seeing other now groups coming up. You're looking at site networks, independent sites that are doing research, but in a different way. But again, you have these whales, right, who, for lack of a better term, have a way of doing things. And then in combination with regulations through the FDA and NIH and all of those things, I don't know what acronym we use now for them. I know everyone has new names over there now, but you have those regulations that has historically taken a while to change too. So it's clinical research has followed very similar trends in some regard, or flows or patterns, I guess.
Yeah. And then you give, the winners. There's this bizarre thing where now I've won. I've got my drug through the FDA.
Have you won? Have you won, really?
Well, no, clearly I haven't won. Let's say I was a drug company. I had my drug gone through the FDA. There's a bunch of ways that I get it to actually get used and paid for, which seem to have no connection to A, what was it approved for in the first place half the time, and then B, how I get paid for it seems to have no connection to the quote unquote value it's delivering to the system. And there's all this work going on after the fact of, the fact that US drug companies spend more money on R&D and marketing, not to mention stock buybacks, legal fees for patent extensions, and all these games after the market, and all these price decisions after the market, which don't seem to have any connection to sort of pure clinical research or the cost effectiveness of the drug. And we're having this massive fight right now with GLP-1s, of course, which look like they do a lot of great stuff, but probably not if we charge $1,200 a month to everyone on them. So I think it's a fascinating game. But I think the other thing that you mentioned you're getting at, Denali, is that you've also got technology changing that, right? Because people used to have to physically go into a center and get prodded, measured, given their drugs to do whatever, and then people would drop out all the time because they weren't being surveilled properly at home. And now you have a bunch of tools and companies who are trying to do this sort of distributed clinical trial and trying to focus on where people are all the time and manage that process. Not the least of which, because you lose people out of those trials, it's incredibly expensive and inefficient, right? So that we've featured a number of those companies over the years at Health 2.0, the sort of Medibles of the world and Metadatas and others who are trying to do this stuff. And I'm buddies with Craig Lipset, who runs the distributed, what's called the distributed
DTRA.
What's it called?
Decentralized Trial and Research Alliance Association, something like that.
Well, we've got an acronym that I may have beaten you on. I didn't know the acronym, but you definitely didn't know it.
Okay, fair.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes, yeah.
But that group, and there are people, that group of people who are trying to push that whole piece along, again, haven't gone as fast as they would do in a sort of rational market, because it's obviously the right thing to do, but it's got these big institutional barriers, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I'm curious about that, because we saw that. I mean, especially I know it was a thing pre-COVID, and I think it became super accelerated and leaned on more post-COVID. We're still seeing a lot of marketing talk about it now. I work at a trial site. I operate a bunch of trial sites, so I've kind of seen, obviously we're still doing a lot of traditional clinical trials, quote unquote, where people are coming in, being poked, prodded, given drug, sent home. And I feel like in the last couple of years, we've seen a big drop off in the sort of DCT movement. Like, is this, I don't know, would you say you've sort of seen the same trend, or is there still some hope we should be?
I mean, it's probably, I haven't looked at distributed trials per se, but if you look at telehealth as a whole, right? Mm-hmm. So you had this event that we could have used to change healthcare, and we definitively used it to not change healthcare, which was unfortunate. I mean, if you look at the investment interest and money going into various flavors of digital health company, obviously shit got crazy in 2020, but it had been picking up before, right? But it was still, I think I went to a conference in 2018 or 19 when Jason Gorovich, the CEO of Teladoc at that point, was presenting, and someone asked the audience, and this was like a conference about digital health and telehealth in San Francisco. So the audience would be a little bit, there was some selection bias in the audience. They said, how many of you have had a telehealth visit? And about 30% of the hands go up. So, when it comes to Q&A, I said to Jason, I said, okay, Jason, here we are in San Francisco with this audience that should know all about this stuff. Why is it only 30% of the hands going up? Why are we at, 1% or 2% of visits, sort of? And he didn't really have a very convincing answer. He said, it's going to take a while, blah, blah, blah. And then we have COVID, and everyone goes, great. Now we close down healthcare. We have to go to telehealth, blah, blah, blah. It goes crazy. But if you looked at what was going on in telehealth at the time, there were 4 or 5 major, quote unquote, early incumbents. There was Teladoc, there was Amwell, there was Doctors on Demand, now Included Health, and there was who did Cigna buy? I'm forgetting the name, but there was a Florida company that Cigna bought. Anyway, it's part of Cigna now. But what actually happened was, if you looked at that 75% of visits now over telehealth, more than half of them were just on the phone, were just phone calls, right? Which is probably pretty fine for most of them. And of the rest, a bunch of them were on these platforms no one ever heard of. Two of them calling themselves the same name, Doximity and DoxyMe, which you said them both quickly.
One has an accent over.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a dot, there's a period somewhere.
It's an umlaut somewhere. There's an umlaut somewhere.
So something like that. And what happened was, pretty soon after that, the institutional inertia took over, and people came back to going back in person. And but we've settled at a pretty decent number. We settle at sort of 10 to 15% of visits being telehealth. And if you look at mental health, which is always a bit weird, it's majority telehealth. So so I think you could argue, I would guess without knowing any of the data, that something similar happened in distributed trials. For a while we spiked up dramatically in 2020 and 2021, and probably back down, but it's much higher than it was in 2018-19. Is my guess.
Yeah, I mean that's probably fair. I think at least from where I sit, it's maybe 10 to 15% fully decentralized. I mean, they're incorporating more decentralized tools or tech platforms that sort of turn it into sort of hybrid trials in a way. But yeah, still it's a little bit confusing because I think most people in the industry recognize the value, but yet it can't seem to really get it quite right, which has been perplexing. Just perplexing, let's say.
I mean, and I think what we're seeing though is that I think you're seeing, we touched on, Brad, like it's the tech that we're seeing sort of move in that direction, right? We're building tools that enable DCT, but fundamentally, are we designing protocols that can operate in a decentralized model? And so it's like, yes, we're developing the research, site tech or, sponsor tech or whatever, industry tech for it, but we're not keeping the rest of it up. The protocol designs, the actual, like what you should be doing isn't matching that. And I think, I would say that's probably fairly common potentially across healthcare, right? Where you're seeing tech develop much faster than the regulations, the operations, the actual ability to deliver.
Is there something specific about clinical trials that that is an actual barrier where I need to see you in person for more than something? I memean, if I can deliver the drug to your house, maybe it's injectable, maybe there's some issues there, but
most visits, and I guess it's a good question because I doubt anyone, as far as I can tell, can answer that with like a lot of confidence. And of course, take into account that I work at a site, so I make more money when people come onto my site and get seen. But you're taking EKGs, you're of course doing physical exams, you are giving patients investigational product versus like shipping them a drug, which, to your point, it's fucking pills, right? Like no reason you couldn't mail somebody some pills to take. But there's a lot of that sort of other hands-on data collection, which honestly though, there's plenty of ways that stuff could be done, with existing technology, aside from a doctor putting hands on you for a physical exam. So ostensibly the answer is no.
Yeah.
But again, the protocols that are being written by the pharmaceutical sponsors are not. It's copy paste. I feel like it's been copy paste for probably 30 years. So we're just not seeing those things implemented, and it's weird to sit because vendors, other like trade associations like DTRA are like, we should be doing this. Why aren't we doing this? It's easy. And sponsors are just like, nah, I'm going to keep doing it this way. And I can't necessarily account for that.
I mean,
chasm.
I mean, the point is supposed to be, right, that if you can make it easier for the patients at home and get them in, they'll stand the trial. They're more likely to stand the trial will close faster. And then, the clock, when the clock is ticking on the patent, you're getting to the end of the trial sooner. So I don't know if they have yet to get to evidence that this trial was just quicker and easier and filled better and faster.
I've not seen that. But
that's the bit that you need to get the end sponsor to believe that we are actually wasting money if we do it for our center. But I mean, I was I ran a class at University of San Francisco last year, and I had a bunch of people to build tools, and one of them built a tool which was for CROs. They built a product tool, didn't become a company, but anyway. And what was struck me is I made them do research for their they did product research and all that kind of good stuff. When I talked to a bunch of people at centers and CROs, and there were a lot of people dropping out because they missed their bus and couldn't get to the center that day or whatever, and did not understand that it was crucially important that they had to be at the center to be measured on that day or the next day, because if they waited a week, they blew the whole thing. And they build a little tool to sort of help communicate back and forth with them. And you've got to imagine that there's a lot of people in centers making phone calls, trying to connect with the patients, and the patients flipping off for whatever reason is going off thing and falling out of the protocol, and then you've lost a very, very valuable person, especially the more esoteric the disease. And this reminds me of a post-market issue which I didn't realize existed, but now more than half of chemotherapy is oral oncology drugs, and I did not know this until I ran into a guy who was doing a startup in this area. And even though and you have to take your full regimen of oncology of chemo drugs,
right?
Or else it doesn't work. So you can't say, I took 60% of them, I'm 60% cured of cancer. That doesn't the whole thing. If you do the whole thing, you're probably going to be cured of cancer. Even though this is going to cure your cancer, some massive proportion of people just drop off, for whatever reason. It makes them sick. They can't get access to the pills. They forget. You'd think these are the people. I mean, I'm on a statin like most middle-aged men. More than middle-aged men might. Men in my
you're young, right? That's your young Holt, right?
Most young rapper, digital health podcast types. Many are on a statin, right? And maybe if I miss one, it's not a big deal. But you've got to take it very consistently. Mm-hmm. It's the same. Did I take it this morning? Actually, yes, this morning I remember taking it. Did I take it yesterday? I think I did. That kind of thing. That's a standard problem, right? With drugs out there in the field. People forgetting they take them, or the drug made them sick. So they say, I'll take a vacation, take a couple of days off, like my exercise program. I'm tired. I'll take a week off, that kind of stuff. And I think that for stuff that's totally vital, I suspect it's very similar in clinical research, where the patient management aspect, and in fact, a lot of people are getting into clinical trials for the clinical, because it's their last hope, or because they want to get access to this drug, and they don't want to take the risk of being in the placebo group or what have you. It seems to me that the patient management, compliance, surveillance aspect of healthcare is done very poorly, even though we've got all these devices, where you can now send people home from the hospital with, rhythm patches on them to do their EKGs, and where you can, literally have now there are people doing blood pressure and God knows what else from a camera. Yeah. And there's all kinds of other surveillance, heading on. There's a company I'm vaguely associated with, and that I'm on their advisory board, but don't do much with them, called Cherish, which is doing falls and fall prevention using some kind of radar through the walls for seniors. There's a lot of stuff going on that could, basically informate the bathroom, track the people. You've got obviously the ability to have people with CGMs on, or watches, or I think you were wearing an Oura ring, Brad. If I look at your maybe it's a regular ring.
Both are actually, yeah.
All right, all of the above. I have none of that stuff, but I've tried it all and sort of given up. But for somebody who is got either a chronic disease, or has some particular condition that needs to be tracked, or cancer or whatever, or is in a clinical trial, you could imagine you could surround by that stuff. And now, using tracking and AI and the smarts of computing, you should know where everybody is at all times, basically, and be very focused on those people. So I'm surprised that we've done as poorly as we have with remote monitoring in all its flavors. It has picked up a little bit in the general healthcare. And I think it's done some good. But
that's what I was going to ask too. Is this uniquely? I mean, I'm sure it's not, but to what degree is it uniquely a clinical trials problem versus a larger healthcare issue? I mean, you see a lot of consumer products,
Yeah.
and super cool, but I can't get somebody to freaking fill out a digital diary, on a daily basis, which, a few questions I need you to answer to your point. And
Yeah.
we're also we do cancer trials, but we're also dealing with patients who have things like it's psoriasis, right? It's that you can live with it. It's not a live or die situation. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously people suffer from it, and I'm not trying to, undercut any pain that people feel from these conditions, but it's a whole lot easier to kind of let those things go when it's, you're not going to die from cancer. Your skin might be itchy. You know what I mean? So it's even harder to sort of keep that link.
My sense is that, we have the underlying problem, which, you can call a behavioral health problem or mental health problem, which is that we are very bad at motivating humans and asking them to change their behavior. Now, if you give them an addictive substance, tobacco, alcohol, food these days, ice cream, in my particular case, they'll figure out ways to get it. And not to mention, drugs, legal and illegal, and all the rest of it. But, if you want, you can motivate behavior in the wrong way quite easily. But don't forget, that's also done with, both addictive substances and usually a lot of marketing. And to get people to, the budget we spend and the marketing spend we do on getting people to sort of do the right thing and behave well is much, much lower. And there's no immediate payoff, right? You don't get the pleasure of eating the bottle of ice cream or taking the hit of nicotine or whatever it happens to be. So that's been a massive problem in healthcare. Great. You walked every day. You did your strength training in 25 years or 15 years, you might do better. And it is it's just a motivational, ongoing problem of getting the drumbeat of getting people to do the right thing all the time and getting good habits ingrained, all the rest of it. And it's just super freaking hard, right? We don't do that well as humans. Humans are very able to be. You can make them fearful very easily, and you can make them respond to an easy incentive, an easy addictive thing that's quick.
So I'm hearing you say
long-term behaviors is
hearing you say cocaine for clinical trial participants.
Yeah, I mean, if the drug came wrapped in cocaine, you got them addicted to it. That might help. Not sure that would be the ultimate.
Well, I mean, are we missing on?
Looking for?
Are we missing out on some of I've seen a little bit of sort of gamification, maybe. The sort of still you're getting a dopamine hit maybe of some kind from your participation or from your successful whatever it may be, taking your drug or doing your diary or God knows what. Is that something I haven't seen a lot of it.
A couple of companies. There was one called Health Prize, which this is more on the adherence. I don't think it was done. May not have been done on clinical trials, but it was done on adherence for I forget whatever medications they're working on. Not if they're still around. It was founded by a neurosurgeon who was grumpy that people keep on showing up with strokes from high blood pressure because they haven't been taking the high blood pressure meds. And the idea was that if you took your meds and could prove it every week, you got entered into a lottery because people like lotteries. And there was another one which is still going, called is it Wealth? God, there's so many companies called Well something. It's called Wealth. Wealth is trying to do the loss aversion technique. They put $50 in your bank account each month. And you take the pill and you have to take a photo of yourself taking the pill. And every time you don't, you lose $2 or $5. It's like they're trying to get humans apparently don't like losing more than they like winning. They like, in terms of people gambling on the stock market, what have you. So it's not none of these things have become widespread phenomena. In general, right? And this is going back to the earlier link I was making between what we do in clinical research and then what happens in real life out there in the field, is that we do a lot of very detailed studies of what's going on in the clinical trial in phase 2 and phase 3 and all the rest of it, and what's the impact of the drug and the minor improvement over the other drug. And now we've just had head-to-head Ozempic versus Wegovy. Is it Ozempic Wegovy?
Is that bound?
Lilly against Novo Nordisk. Indianapolis beat out Denmark. Go USA!
Right.
We also got the Pope, so
Yeah,
That's right.
You know, like the Pope and the King of the world. I mean, great time to be American if you kind of close your eyes.
Sort of, sometimes.
We have the World Cup and the Olympics coming up. What could possibly go wrong?
There you go. Don't say that.
But you know, but when you get out there in the field and how does this stuff actually get used in real life? You know, it's all over the place, and we don't really track it very well. You know, there are phase 4 studies. So Eric Topol, right, who's still the god of the whole, you know, research through the use of digital technologies, and you know, great guy. He wrote a book in 2009. I don't know how to health 2.0, 2010, 11, 12, sometime around that, 13. He's written a couple of books, but the first book he wrote, which I'm blanking on the name, was it The Patient Will See You Now? No, there was one before that. But in that book, he basically said, look, we should get rid of all this phase 1, not phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We should make the bar to approval much lower. And then we should be doing, you know, radical surveillance of everybody who's on a pill, on whatever device, you know, and figuring out what's going on much bigger populations and using our ability to do data analysis and all the rest of it to figure stuff out. And I think that's the problem with, you know, clinical research. You get to phase 3, it goes over, and then you have, like I said, the lawyers take over saying, how can I extend this patent and how can I stop a generic company coming in to get it? You know, I probably could just have this article about the use of thalidomide for cancer patients. I can't remember the name of the drug. One of you will help me? No?
Sorry.
I'll look it up in the next break. But amazing article, right? Celgene basically owned the rights to thalidomide. It became, you know, a bunch of researchers and patients found out that it worked for a particular group of people with cancer. And, you know, the price went from $7 a pill to, you know, $25,000 a month.
Of course.
Good.
Of course it did.
But no real logical reason other than that they were desperate. And, you know,
we could.
Because
they could.
Get away with it, right? And the same drug costs, you know, $1.29 in England. You know. Even Trump noticed this, right? He said, "I get $13 here and 88 pounds or whatever in the UK."
Hey, I'll have you know we're a favored nation, so we need that.
I do love our new way of making laws. You write a long rambling tweet on Truth Social, and that's it just when I saw Monty Makari like trying to talk about that, I got a tweet out which was, "This is like, you know, the sales guy, the head of sales, goes out with a client, gets shit-faced at dinner, and promises him that the product will do all of this stuff. And the poor product manager the next day is called in and said, okay, well, you said the product, you sold us this, and the product with this. And he's going, oh, God, how do I make it?
Right.
Except we don't have the oh, God moments. We just make another one.
Well, I mean, who knows? We'll find out. We'll find out what happens. I mean, you know, it's the one thing in theory I do approve. I don't think the way we buy drugs makes any sense. And I can't see my way through to a rational sort of free market way of doing it. I think we should have one list of drug prices and just be done with it. And you know, you could argue what they do in Japan, interesting enough, is that the first couple of years the drug price is higher and it goes down over time. So there is a little bit of incentive to bring a new drug to market. But I've always said that if you just stopped all drug development at any one point and correctly use the drugs that we have on the market, the health benefits, you know, would be much greater than developing new drugs. Not that I'm saying we should stop the NIH spending, although apparently we have done that. But if you, there's a number of doctors who are looking at, you know, what is the correct treatment for managing diabetes? It's usually getting a lot of people on metformin, which costs almost nothing, and yet, you know, the number of people on that correct protocol who have diabetes is, you know, in the single-digit percentages. Yeah. And the same thing is true with hypertension. There's a group, I think it's in Cleveland, that has figured out how to manage hypertension for African American men, and they have, I think, 90%. I will try and find you guys who you've shown us you see, when you get old, when you're young and you have early onset Alzheimer's, you forget it. But the group actually had, you know, 85-90% compliance with guidelines for their patients with high blood pressure. And if you go up to the state of California, the guy doing this was giving you a talk in California, the average is like 28%. And Kaiser, you know, who we're singing the praises of, I think they're at 45% or maybe 50%. You know, they're just so. most people are like holding their hands up saying, well, we can't get these people to do it. You can get these people to do it if if you're prepared to invest the time and effort and the technology and the human relationship and yada yada yada. It's just that we don't. And so it seems to me that you could do that. Now, having said that, of course, had we not had medical research, we wouldn't have Ozempic and a bunch of the cancer drugs which do actually work. So
Sure.
you've got it's a bit BS for me to say you should stop all drug development. Just use the ones effectively you have, but you should use the ones you have effectively. And of course, we are massively influenced by pharma pursuing profit for the drugs it's newer drugs that are on the market and extending the patent life of those and doing all kinds of legal games to do that, as opposed to figuring out what should we get most people on, what generic should we most people on. And there are a ton of, well, if we have these two drugs and we put them in one pill, we can call it a new drug and expend the patent, and it becomes $1,500 a month instead of $20 a month or whatever for the two separate bills. All those games are played at mass extent, and we spend way more money on marketing and patent attorneys than we do on R&D, even though we spend a lot on R&D within the drug, the big pharma and biotech community and private sector. Although we also spend a hell of a lot on R, not so much D, via NIH. And that's the bit which is being, there probably should be some rational, I would say cutting, but rational reallocation of both those sets of dollars. Unfortunately, when we got to Doge coming in there with their chainsaw and just hacking stuff up before we even had a new NIH director, not I'm a big fan of the new NIH director. We did not do that in what looked like a rational, calm manner.
Well, and I think I was talking to someone yesterday who's like, I don't think you'll find anyone in the industry who's like, who says like, no, we're super efficient. There's no room for change. Everything is great. We don't need to make change. I mean, I think everyone who is in the industry would say like, yes, we need to make more efficiencies. We need to make this a better process. But to your point, like sometimes that needs a scalpel, not a chainsaw to be effective.
Yeah.
Not a blowtorch.
I mean,
why not? Some napalm.
The chainsaw that Mr. Musk directed. I mean, I just thought it was just done. And he said we're going to save $2 trillion, but I mean, it was just you start with organizations that spend no money. Start with USAID and the Consumer Financial Protection Board. There is that you could close them down as they did, and you're saving almost nothing. You're saving a rounding error, and you've got to look at the U.S. government and say, where does it spend money? It spends money in defense and healthcare and paying interest on the debt, and there's all this stuff as well. But it doesn't really spend money on personnel. I mean, relatively low numbers. It doesn't really. There's not that many. Even if you believe there was $100 million or was it $100 billion survey of national park people, or they said there was to be cut. This thing they made up that they said they were cutting. Even if you believe that, there aren't that many of them, right? At some point, you've got to get rid of an aircraft carrier. You've got to say we're going to figure out a way to spend, a lot less on healthcare, and they may figure that out with Medicaid. I doubt it.
I don't know, man. I see a lot of park rangers walking around with like Coach and Louis Vuitton, so I don't know.
It's true. It's I believe it's finally time for park rangers to stop suckling the teat of living the high life on our dime.
Yes, that's sort of a backcountry Ritz-Carlton that they're all staying in. We don't have access.
True.
Secret.
Yeah, that's. We're getting a bit away from clinical research, but that in terms of sort of value for money and things that people actually like and value. There's a reason the national parks are crowded. People like
I mean, I feel like it's one of the, I don't want to say few, but it's one of the great things about America is the national park system, right? People, I mean, I do think that's like renowned across the world how good our park system is. But
but some of the stuff that's been going right in terms of the chainsaw. So I was at a meeting last week, and someone was telling me about the fact that CDC has a group of people who check for health conditions on cruise ships, salmonella, and we're hearing there's an outbreak of whatever, and they're gone. Good luck. So at least we're not going to know which cruise ship has what until it gets really bad.
It's cruise ship roulette.
do I want to be on the cruise ship that has the outbreak of, Legionnaire's disease or salmonella or whatever the hell it is?
But we won't know about it. So did it
Well,
really exist?
We may know about it eventually.
Didn't happen.
Schrodinger's cruise ship.
Yeah.
Very good. Now we're down here the last few minutes here. Apparently, we have an incredibly quiet audience today. So, guys, you got like
well, they
2
heard
minutes.
they heard I was on. I didn't show up.
Well, we've been doubling up the two the last couple of weeks. We might be wearing out our audience at this point. They're probably sick of hearing from us. So, it's not your fault, Matt. Well, yeah, no, I want to thank you for coming on. Anything else you want to end with, or you want to plug?
So I know I'm very interested in figuring out, if there is a combination in clinical research. Are we going to make significant breakthroughs that do get through the healthcare system? So I think the obvious candidate for this is GLP-1s. The other obvious candidate is the mRNA vaccine, which I know has got into this massive, insane maelstrom of anti-science and science and what have you. But if you look at what's come out of clinical research and drugs from the market, there are some significant, I don't belittle it, but there have been some significant advances, right? And at some point, that's what's going to fix healthcare. Go back to my thing about use and drugs mattering and the rest of medicine not mattering so much. So you have GLP-1s, which clearly the first two, the Danes versus Indianapolis group is one, but there's about 50 coming behind them. Some of which apparently are going to make us lose weight and have muscle. I'm waiting for that one, so I can.
Let me know when that happens.
I hear there's one. I mean, again, I was told by somebody.
I want to know when it also grows your hair back. So
they have other pills for that, but they probably don't do. Wait,
yeah.
Your hair, come on. But then you have, the sort of stuff that the mRNA folks are working on, which is, can we use this as a vaccine to stop a bunch of other stuff? Can we use it as a vaccine to stop cancer, all the rest of it? And you have this tremendous success of cervical cancer reduction due to vaccination. So I'm wondering if that, if in not 5 years' time, but in 15 to 20 years to 30 years' time, we have a bunch of medications that really, take out big swaths, and I'm thinking vaccines and medications that take out big swaths of things that are really significant. So if you think about the big problems we have, heart disease, stroke, diabetes,
measles.
Yeah, let's. Measles is not yet a big problem again, but it's more of a problem. It's more of a problem than it should be, right? But I mean, if you think of those big categories, and then things, you related obesity, addiction. I wonder then maybe, and GLP-1s are so interesting because it looks like they do a bunch of other stuff on the side. It looks like they are powerful anti-addiction drugs. It looks like they are powerful. They have a big impact on heart disease and kidney disease and functions that, which were not as advertised, and I'm wondering if, that's what ends up changing the healthcare system. So that's one big chunk that I think is super interesting going forward. The other thing, which you hear a lot of conversation about, and I think is very interesting and probably coming too late for me because I'm young, but you old people might have something to do with it, get the benefit of this, is there's this whole discussion about longevity, right? And what really we're talking about is that somewhere around the late people's 60s to 70s, they start slowing down, start getting more conditions, more diseases. Healthcare costs for people in their 60s is about 3 times what it is for people in their 50s, which is actually 3 times what it is for people in their 40s who don't have many costs unless they have early stage cancer, basically. So can you basically halt that age progression and make people in their 60s look like people in their 70s and make people in their 70s look like people in their 60s? Am I getting the right way around there? Because when you get to the 80s, in general, some people, obviously die earlier. Some people die, some people, get into their 90s. But that's when you get to things like Alzheimer's, all these progressive diseases that cost a fortune and ruin people's lives.
Yeah.
And if you could make people healthier and more productive through, whether it's the madman, Brian Johnson taking 900 supplements and pretending he's going to live forever or whatever. Well, I don't know what the answer is.
That guy.
But if you can make people healthier and productive and give them another, 10, 15 productive years, sort of 65. But we've done it to some extent. Sure. But then you start thinking like getting back in the workforce because we're running out of young people, apart from me. And of course, I don't know at what point people are going to die, but I was in a fascinating conversation with this health camp retreat I went to a couple of weeks ago with Thomas Guest, the ex-editor of Wired, who now runs Project Age. And Thomas said, rationally, if we can get all this right, the majority of people at that age should be dying by suicide, should be dying voluntarily because they had enough, because they're not being killed by those other things at old age. They come to old age. So, that's probably way out of the scope of what we're looking at. But maybe in 15 to 20 to 30 years time, we've made that end of life or last few decades of life much, much healthier and more productive. That's what I think we can hope for. Then in the issues that we've got to die something at some point. When is that? Blah, blah, blah. But what we've done now is we extended life dramatically from where it used to be. I mean, don't forget, when Social Security came in, the average American was at 65. They put it there because the average American died at 67. Now the average American is dying, depending if you're a man or a woman, in the late 70s, early 80s. And in some other countries, Japan and South Korea and elsewhere, they're dying in the mid 80s, 90s. And we've got to try and figure out how to make that part of life healthy and productive. So that probably comes from, whatever the next thing we're going to discover about the next version of GLP-1, whatever the hell it is, or mRNA. And that's, I think, the really interesting stuff to focus on sort of longer term. I may not be around to see that, but that's where I think, if you care about clinical research, there's a lot of stuff to fix, a lot of stuff to cure, but that really is the sort of the holy grail of, can we get people to die at 90, drop dead on a day, having had an incredibly productive last 25 years of their life.
Right. Yeah. No, I've been, anxiously sort of awaiting to see more longevity drugs or protocols. We haven't really seen that quite yet. I mean, Brian Johnson is a little bit of a goof in my book, but conceptually, it's fascinating to me. Yeah. And I look forward to seeing that stuff, just not quite there yet, at least not on a big scale.
By the way, we've discovered the answer to Denali's nickname. It's next to her left ear the whole time. Boss Lady Denali. That's it.
I'll take it. Great.
It's not bad. All right. You've been christened. Very good. Well, Matthew, again, thanks so much for coming on. Where can people check you out? Is it the healthcareblog.com?
Thehealthcareblog.com. I'm on LinkedIn, Matthew Holt. Very easy to find. There's a guy called Matt Holt who runs a hedge fund PE fund in healthcare, and it's much better looking, younger, richer. So ignore that guy.
Don't talk to that guy.
Actually, I talk to him now and again. I say things like, we have the same name. Why don't we just share the name, share the LinkedIn profile, share the bank account? He just smiles and grins at me for the last one. Never mind.
I like it. All right. Well, again, thanks, Matthew, and not Matt. Young Holt and Denali. Any final words? We have what are we doing next week?
Next week we're gonna pull something out of the archive. So I'll truck out to Iron Mountain, pull something out, and show you some retro footage, and then we'll be back the following week.
Send Elon down the mine to get the record.
Yes.
Good idea. Good idea. All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks for listening to Note to File. We're committed to continuing to bring you independent and unfiltered coverage of the clinical trial industry.
We want to talk about what you want to hear. So if you have something on your mind, hit us up at notetofilepodcast.com.